The wonderful Bill Deresiewicz is joining us for I believe it's the third time that he's appeared on this show. So welcome again. Um,
Thank you.
he recently published an essay on the website Persuasion titled How Art Lost Its Way, the subtitle being An Unserious Culture Lacks the Ability to Sustain High Art. Welcome to the show, Bill. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I should say that, as always, the title and subtitle were not of my choosing. I don't dislike them, but the piece is really about arts criticism. But I know you're going to ask me about that, so we'll talk about it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Before we begin, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the passing of one great David Lynch, filmmaker, musician, all-around artist, and from what I've heard, a great human being.
Yeah, I really love David Lynch and his work. It's something that my wife and I also share. We watched The Fabelmans, right? The Spielberg movie that Lynch has a cameo in at the end as John Ford, and that made us watch. So this was just a couple of years ago, I think. That made us realize that we had never watched Inland Empire. It was the last movie, I think, and so we watched it, and it's incredible. I think like I jumped up in the middle, practically screaming, like because this guy is like it's just you don't know what he's doing to you, but he's doing something. So we did that, and then we went back and we rewatched the whole Twin Peaks from the beginning because we had watched season three, but it had been a long time, and I hadn't actually watched the first two seasons. So really kind of dove deeply into it, and we had also seen him in person talking about transcendental meditation at Yale many years ago, and not immediately, but I do TM and I think about David Lynch. I mean, I try not to think about it while I'm doing TM, but I think about the fact that he did it and he was the first person I heard talk about it. And you may know that there was a 10-minute global meditation in his honor.
Oh yeah, yeah, I
I
did.
think, yeah, which I fortunately found out about in time and was very happy to have participated in. I mean, there's also a really good documentary that we just watched called The Art Life from a few years ago. That's about his early life up to Eraserhead, but you also see him in his studio as an old man. He was an incredible figure, and his art is unique. And I think about the fact I was also thinking about this watching the Dylan movie, which I think is a good movie, but I'm not comparing it to Lynch's movie. But what I was thinking then and thought again with Lynch is the extraordinary capacity that art has to. I guess this is a cliche, but it actually forms our consciousness, right? Like it's not just that it informs us the way information does or nonfiction or journalism. It's actually like these people are giving us pieces of ourselves, whether it's, Dylan's early songs or Lynch's movies. They're supplying us with a conscious, not entirely, but with art that is this profound. And I guess this leads into what we're going to talk about, because that's such a huge difference from the way, well, probably from the way a lot of art has long been consumed, but certainly from the way most, perhaps for some people, all of it is consumed now because it's produced so differently now.
Yeah. And speaking of Bob Dylan,
Yeah,
I think the movie, right, A Complete Unknown with
yeah,
Timothy Chalamet, I think it
yeah.
chronicled his artistic life up to the point where he performed in, was it
Newport, yeah,
yes,
the Newport
Newport.
Folk Festival. He went
And
electric, yes.
yes, that was a very controversial one, but
Mhm.
later lived with it. And I wonder, was there a critic or a champion of some kind that says, this is the future of music and you should pay attention?
I'm not familiar enough with what was going on in rock music criticism in the middle of the 60s. I would be very surprised if there weren't plenty of people who were very into what he was doing as well. I mean, the folkies obviously hated it. That's the myth, and apparently there's a lot of truth to it. But I suspect that there were a lot of people who were very but whether there were specific rock critics, I don't know what the state of rock criticism was at that point. I feel like it was maybe a little too early for Lester Bangs, but I'm sure there were people writing. I don't know.
Yeah. When I read your essay, yeah, I remember that there was a time when there were some like really great publications and outlets that focus on,
Yeah,
artistic endeavors and creations.
yeah,
The New Yorker and
yeah,
Rolling Stone and Village Voice and
yes,
to a certain extent, the New Republic. All of
Yes.
these sites or magazines
Yes.
have gone out the window right now. I mean, they still exist, but they are barely a shell of their former selves. And
I think, yeah, I think the New Yorker still has a few good people,
mhm,
and some of them are even relatively new, like Paru Segal, I think is a terrific book critic. But yes, the New Yorker is very different from what it used to be. And the other places, I mean, The Voice went out of business and now it's back as a website that I doubt many people pay attention to. And of course, the New Republic. Yeah, yes, yes. I interrupted. Go ahead.
yeah, and I believe you wrote in The Death of the Artist that all of this is due to the fact that the internet comes about and it sort of democratized the way that we publish things. Like anyone, including myself, is a publisher and contributor and editor of some kind. So why is this like sort of democratization of publication reduce the value of art criticism and as well as the merits of art critic?
Right. So there's several things, and some of them are to do with the internet, and I think maybe the most interesting one clearly predates the internet, and I think needs more sort of analytic work than I've brought to it. So the internet, it's not that it's the problem is not that it's democratized arts criticism. In fact, that's probably the one thing that's saving arts criticism, but it's only allowing it to flourish in niches, as I say in the essay that I'm here to talk about. Some of the dance critics I mentioned who used to have, including Deborah Jowett, who used to write a full page in the tabloid-sized Village Voice. She's in her 90s. She still writes dance criticism, but as far as I can tell, she writes it for specialized webs. And that's true in general arts criticism. But what the internet did is that it destroyed the business model of places like The Voice, right? And one of the key things is that it unbundled, right? So every article, every kind of thing needs to justify its existence on its own basis, as opposed to what they call cross-subsidization, where you have a sports section that drives readers to a newspaper, but the newspaper can also have foreign bureaus that are essentially cross-subsidized by the sports section and whatever else, the entertainment section, whatever else people cooking, you know. So it's that, and then also it's about what the internet has done, not to arts criticism, but to the art. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I said, like, under what terms, in what ways do people consume things like music now? Dylan would put out an album and the world would come to a standstill because that didn't happen very often. And there wasn't a ton of music in circulation. And the songs had been very carefully crafted and the album had been carefully crafted and all that. And now we just have a flood of content all the time. And even the artists, even serious artists, in order to sustain themselves, the model is you have to pump out tons of content. So even we see this in TV. We had a golden age of TV 20 years ago where there was really a lot of great stuff. And now it's just, tons of, I love the term mid. I think that's one of my favorite of the millennial coinages. There's just so much stuff that's mid. I'm not even sure it's that mid anymore. It's like sub-mid. So there's that. And then people, what's made cheaply, and this is so much what Death of the Artist is about, what's made cheaply, what's made in haste, is going to be consumed in haste because it doesn't repay anything deeper than that. The one piece that predates the internet, and that I said I think requires more thought, is that to a certain extent, I mean, this obviously didn't happen all at once, but I talk about a loss of seriousness in the piece, and I think they did put that in the subtitle, an unserious culture. It seems pretty clear that over the decades, since around the time that Dylan showed up, we've gotten less and less serious, especially in our engagement with art. And we can talk about what that means. I think one of the things it means that I talk about in the piece, and I've talked about before, is that we don't demand of ourselves what we used to demand when we engage with serious art. In fact, I think the whole idea of serious art is kind of in disrepute. It's maybe seen as pretentious. And as I and others, thinking of Mark Greif in particular, have noted, like, that's actually not true in all areas of life. Like, if we could take art as seriously as we take working out, we would be in good shape. But there's some things that we're willing to push ourselves, some realms in which we're willing to push ourselves, like health and beauty, muscle, and some in which we're not, like the mind and the spirit.
Yeah. I think I came across a quotation by John Waters, the great John Waters, in which he said that I think we're saturated with irony right now in that almost all art pieces by someone who wishes to be taken seriously has to be
Mm,
ironic in some fashion. He remembers that, when he was during the 1970s when so-called B movies were
mhm,
popular, and I suppose like exploitation films.
mhm.
The filmmakers were taking themselves seriously. They really thought that they were making like a grand piece of art and entertainment. But I suppose waters reflect that today that's not the case. Like if you make something that is bad, then you have to make it like so bad it's good. That's the classification that's popular these days, so that people will watch it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to exactly what John Waters was saying there, but I think, and I don't know if this is what he means, but I think in general, I mean, this goes back to the kind of irony that David Foster Wallace was trying to push back against, that kind of shows up, and I love David Letterman, but it kind of shows up with Letterman in the sort of that era in the 80s, where it wasn't cool to be serious about things. It wasn't cool to be serious politically. It wasn't cool to be earnest, to be morally serious. So even if you were trying to be, like you said, there had to be this kind of self-undercutting gesture. They used to drive me crazy with Colbert. Now I can't, I don't even deal with Colbert because he's just completely sold out. But even, in his old show, like even when he was being intellectual, he would have to sort of like make sort of Joe Sixpack feel okay, like not feel looked down to. I think Americans have this tremendous chip on their shoulder about being condescended to. And it's funny, like moral seriousness has come back, at least in the form of, political passion. It's not exactly the seriousness of moral self-examination, but whatever. But not artistic seriousness, not seriousness about the engagement with art. I mean, I think there are artists that are serious, but I think it's tough going for them.
Oh yeah, yeah. So how would you define a serious culture?
Well, I think first of all, moral seriousness meaning moral self-examination. In other words, you are actually looking at yourself and you're looking at yourself with the possibility of changing your life, of changing your behavior. I think that's what moral seriousness means. It's not just sort of a theoretical debate such as college students might have, like taking your life seriously as something that you're really responsible for, to some higher or external standard. I mean, religion gives you this. I'm not a religious person, but this is one of the things that a good form of religion does. And maybe, well, I realize now this is kind of obvious that one of the reasons we're becoming less serious is that we're becoming more secular. And in relation to art, I mean, art makes moral demands too in a different way than religion. It makes us look at ourselves, but it also makes cognitive and I know there's no good word for this, but spiritual or existential demand. What I say in that piece and have said elsewhere is that you should be approaching a serious work of art with a sense of great humility. It's not, I mean, you don't have to like everything, but you're not judging it, it's judging you. And I say there that it's something you need to make yourself worthy of. Obviously, I don't mean worthy in like a moralistic sense, but in other words, rising to meet the challenge of understanding it. I mean, can just mean like David Lynch, right? I mean, his work is difficult, and it takes patience, and it takes deep thought and feeling, and rewatching, and I think and understanding that as part of your project in life, as a central part of your project in life, to me is and you ask what makes a society serious. It's a society that proposes that to people, and that in which the culture, at least at some level, it doesn't have to be at every level, but at some level, the culture is an ongoing conversation about the things that serious art raises.
So you would probably disagree very much with Oscar Wilde's notion that all art is quite useless.
Well, I mean, aside from the irony that we always have to unpack with him, and that's, it's funny. I mean, that's the preface to the picture of Dorian Gray. The Dorian picture of Dorian Gray kind of has a pretty obvious moral message. So it's sort of, is he working against himself? But the real issue there is what does he mean by useless? I actually have a piece people can find it on the same page of my website, the essays and reviews page that the one we're talking about is on, called 13 Ways of Looking at Art. It came out in Salmagundi, I think about 6 months or a year ago. And it starts with Wilde, I mean, it's asking what art is for. And I just give 13 different answers, but I start with Wilde's statement that art is useless. But as I understand it, and I think pretty much how it's generally understood, is what he's saying is that art, the purpose of art is art, right? It's art for art's sake. It's not, I mean, he's coming out of the Victorian, so it's not art for a moralistic purpose. I think that's what he means by art is useless. And that actually raises the stakes for art. It doesn't diminish them. It says that you need to engage with what art is giving you on its own terms, which I've already been talking about, right? Like it's a form of truth that does not need to be and should not be justified in terms of some other value, right? Truth, beauty. I mean, obviously, when we're talking about Wilde, we're talking about beauty. That these things are ends in themselves. They're not, and we see. I mean, if he's thinking about the Victorians and their sort of moralistic approach to art, we live in a time when we have a different kind of instrumentalization of art, which is the political. I mean, it's really just another version of the moral, right? So we have, I mean, even great contemporary artists like Ben Lerner. There was a piece about this in Liberties several years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but he talked about how even people like Ben Lerner are bending over backwards to apologize for doing something as frivolous as writing fiction in times like ours, and can only justify what they're doing as a contribution to the struggle, which I think is appalling. And insofar as, and I love Ben Lerner, and I still think his novels are great, but insofar as this kind of thinking has it started to infiltrate its way into them, I think they've been diminished. I mean, to cite another Liberties essay, Becca Rothfeld, also from a few years ago, Virtue, what are they called? I can't remember the name of the thing. Sanctum, I think she calls it sanctimony fiction, right? And she mentions Ben Lerner and she mentions Sally Rooney. This is not what, this is not what art should be about. It shouldn't, yeah. I mean, we could, you know what I'm talking about. We could expand on this if you want to.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
The Sanctimony novel, that's what it is. Yeah.
yeah, sanctimony novel literature. I do remember that essay. I think
Yes.
she focuses on the author Sally Rooney a lot, and
She does. Yeah.
yeah, and she cites her as the kind of like literature that is soapboxy in its messaging. And the author is trying to convey a message, a moral standpoint that she himself does not adhere to fully. So I guess that's the gist of it. I really should go back to reading it.
I mean, I like Sally Rooney. I think she doesn't quite measure up to the kind of ambitious, her work doesn't quite measure up to the kind of ambitious and complex fiction that formed my taste. But I think, I mean, there's a lot to like about her. But I think if I remember what Becca Rothfeld is saying, it's that it's soapboxy, but it's more specifically that the author wants to make sure that she's a good person, meaning that she has all the right opinion. And that makes me really sad, because if it seems to me that if fiction, one of the essential things that the fiction I love gives us is that it forces us to recognize that none of us are good and none of us are bad. Maybe some of us are bad, but for the most part, we're mixed creatures. This is what moral realism is, and this is what the moral value, I think, of reading fiction is to recognize our complexity, our sort of our dark impulses, and not yeah.
Yeah. I suppose another slogan or motto that comes up often is that art should was it comfort the disturbed and disturb the comforted?
Comfort the distressed, probably, or comfort the oppressed.
Okay. Yeah.
And oppress the comfortable, or
Yeah.
disturb the comfortable. Maybe it is disturbed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you subscribe to that notion?
Well, no. I don't think I've heard this said about journalism, and I don't really like it with journalism either, but I remember hearing this in journalism school. But certainly not fiction. I don't think fiction should be in the business of comforting people. I also don't know what it would mean to write a novel that comforts the oppressed. I mean, you're going to get a lot of crappy identity politics fiction with that. And then to oppress or distress or disturb the comfortable, I mean, it should disturb everybody. And I mean, now we're going to start dividing. I mean, already implicit in that formulation is that we're now dividing people into the distressed and the comfortable. Maybe there's some middle ground in between. And it's just, and then we just get into the head games of the liberal elite that, have brought so much disaster. We're now 2 days into the Trump administration. This liberal guilt that they inflict on, I mean, if, I wouldn't care if they just inflicted it on themselves, but these people just inflict their own guilt on the entire world. They make everyone miserable with their own guilt. So no, I don't think that's a good formula for fiction.
Okay, yeah, understood. Straying away from politics since it's such a distressing topic to address right now. Yeah, you mentioned Trump, and I had to sort of like quit social media for at least a week because there's a lot of like performative outrage being published. When I think of art criticism, my mind immediately jumps to the opening scene of Mel Brooks's History of the World Part One.
You'll have to remind me.
Okay, so Orson Welles narrating, and he was like explaining war history in an homage to, I believe, 2001: Space Odyssey, and then he says that the first work of art was made, so a cave painting by a caveman, and then followed by the first work of art criticism, where caveman number two just pisses on the cave drawing that caveman one painted. So that is the perception of art criticism that is shared by a good amount of people who create art. It's like you don't create anything. You just swoop in and make 2 or 3 sentences that are snide or derogatory. So I guess with that in mind, what do you believe make good art critics?
Right. So first, before I get to that, let me say that I would adapt a formulation of Wilde and say that for artists, the only thing worse than being reviewed is not being reviewed. I mean, yes, artists have always complained very often, very wittily about critics ever since there have been critics. But I don't actually think they would want to do without. And I think artists are always thrilled when they get positive criticism, especially intelligent criticism. Sometimes they're thrilled when they get intelligent negative criticism. A lot of reviewing is just crap. A lot of reviewing is just sort of consumer guides or whatever, or worse. I think that, and this is implicit in a lot of what we were talking about before, about the role of art and culture in society. Culture should be a conversation. I mean, this is another cliche. Art is there for us to respond to. And there are different ways to respond, including by making art in response to art, which I think is what artists do. But, we mere mortals like to talk about what we see and read, and I think that's good. I think it's good for art. And to me, the critic's role is to incite or seed or lead the conversation. Not every, and not everybody treats it this way. A lot of people read reviews and critics just to sort of quote unquote eat their opinions for breakfast, and then or to have something to say at the dinner party, and that's not good. But that era of criticism that I evoke in my piece, when I came of age in the 80s and 90s, and there were all these great critics around, they helped you see or read the art better. They helped you do your thinking. And then I think the other very important function, which I do talk about in the piece, is to champion difficult work. And there's a long history of artists doing this. I point out that art's criticism, in the sense that we understand it, really starts with the Romantic. I mean, Vasari wrote the lives of the artists in the 16th century, and Samuel Johnson wrote the lives of the poets a generation before the Romantics. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about ongoing periodical criticism of new work, right? So, not writing about Shakespeare, but writing about stuff as it comes out, having that conversation. And right from the beginning, with the Romantics, with Wordsworth, who broke conventions, Wordsworth suddenly starts writing in ballad stanzas and writing about characters that, peasants, common people, that you weren't supposed to write poetry about. And there was a great deal of resistance and even ridicule. And the great critic of his time, William Hazlitt, championed Wordsworth. And, and it kept going from there. John Ruskin championing Turner, and Edmund Wilson I mentioned in the piece. And I was thinking specifically of Axel's Castle, which is about the great modernists, Proust, Woolf, Joyce, bringing this difficult work to audiences by helping them see what's valuable in it, helping them get past their prejudices that art should look like the art that they grew up with, that there are decorums of form or content that shouldn't be violated. And that continued. I mean, maybe that's still going on and I'm just not aware of it. But it certainly continued up through the time that I started to engage. I talked about Arlene Croce, whose death was the occasion for the piece, the great dance critic, and I didn't have room to tell the whole story, but Mark Morris, who, one of the great choreographers, one of my absolute favorite choreographers, and he was a young guy from Seattle making dances in New York and staging them in small performance spaces and not getting any traction. And out of the blue, she wrote a piece about him for the New Yorker, which, was the ultimate. And apparently he was literally on his way back to Seattle, moving back to Seattle, because he was being discouraged. He had been discouraged. He wasn't going to stop making dances, but he was discouraged about New York. And his friend, who I think became the manager of the company, he must have had him paged in the airport. He was literally in the airport. And his friend read the entire review to him over the phone. This would have been a payphone in the airport. This career-making review. It was called Mark Morris Comes to Town. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. This is one of the huge roles that critics play or can play.
Yeah, you mentioned Stanley Crouch in the piece, and I remember when I'm still reading his work, Notes of a Hanging Judge. That's his book, and yeah, it's a great exploration of not just jazz. Well, Stanley Crouch is really big on jazz, but the culture, like Black American culture too, like how wonderfully. I guess the term diverse is overused right now, but it applies, but also how wonderfully conversational it is. And Crouch has always been sort of like branded by, well, this liberal elite that you're talking about as a contrarian or a bit of a curmudgeon because he doesn't champion newer jazz formats.
And he had some politically problematic opinions.
Yeah,
if I'm correct about that.
Yeah,
he didn't toe the Black intellectual line.
Yeah, I have to look. I'll have to look more into that. But yeah, but yeah, he showed that Black culture is very much conversational and discursive, which is something that I suppose the liberal elite that we are punching down upon do not understand. They believe that there's always like this one singular voice that speaks for Black America.
Yeah.
And every 10 or 20 years there's this other one. I'm not sure what happens to I suppose Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram X. Kendi is sort of vying for that position now. But Crouch shows otherwise. There's a lot of conversation and ideas and philosophy that shows up in artistic creations made by Black Americans. And I think the function of the critic is to, well, sure, to challenge a certain conventional wisdom, but also to show that to contribute to the discourse and show that art can be discursive in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Sort of bring out the implications of sort of the larger cultural implications. I think that's a great form of criticism. You're making me think. I mean, does he use jazz as an analogy, this polyphonic form?
I haven't come across that essay yet, but this is my
no. I'm wondering. I haven't read Stanley Crouch since before he died. But the liberal elite does not feel too comfortable with polyphony at this point. I think that's a great difference from the days of Dylan, the 60s, the 70s, when sort of progressive culture was insurgent, and now it's established, so it doesn't want a polyphony of voices. You're also making me think, well, a couple of things. One is that some of the greatest art critics have actually been artists, and they may not call themselves critics. But in other words, there's some painters who are the best people who've talked about painting. And I was going to think of Virginia Woolf or T.S. Eliot, and this is one of the humbling things about being a literary critic, as I am, or mostly as I was. Like know that you're never going to be better, even at what you do, than some of the people you're writing about, because they're writers. And the other thing you're making me think is that it's a common trajectory among art critics, and in my definitely minor way, have followed this trajectory myself. But I'm thinking of people like Trilling and plenty of others. You start as an art critic, and you train your attention and your ability to look deeply on complex works of art. But I think your natural curiosity, as well as what the art itself is about, leads you to become more broadly a cultural critic. I mean, that term has gotten so debased now, cultural criticism. It's like the crap that the Times publishes. But I mean, sort of, what it sounds like you're saying Crouch was doing as well. Like as opposed to the kind of cultural criticism that they publish, that somebody like a journalist ends up publishing, which is usually very shallow. But I think what I'm saying is that training your mind and your perception on works of art is a great way to learn to think very deeply about the broader culture and its currents, and even about politics. I still haven't written this piece. Maybe I never will, but again, back in the 60s and 70s, there was great writing about politics by fiction writers. I mean, well, Didion is an example. Mailer has a whole set of books about politics that are fantastic, like Miami and the Siege of Chicago, which is about the two conventions in 1968. And there were a few others. They're so much deeper than the kind of stuff that a journalist produces or a pundit or a political scientist produces. And I think, I mean, I'm not going to say this is true to the exclusion of all other kinds of thinking, but I think that art, the kind of thinking that goes into art is deeper than just about any other kind.
Yeah,
They see into things much more, much more. We should just be listening to them. And instead, their voices are drowned out, and we have to listen to these idiots.
yeah. I believe there was a piece that you wrote some years ago. Maybe it was on Unheard, that website, where you mentioned that when you were teaching students, you mentioned that these students, they haven't learned how to read yet, not in the sense that they're illiterate, they cannot read, but they haven't learned to, I guess, love reading, and that in turns transitions to how they do not write well. So, the course is in English literature, I believe, and
Yeah.
these essays are not the most
Yeah.
well written.
Yeah.
And I
Sure.
think
Yeah.
I think that sort of like discouragement of, I guess, reading and writing deeply has, I guess, transitioned itself into the pages of great newspapers, or used to be great newspapers, where you read these op-ed pages and you know for sure that these people have not read much and they have not written much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I remember the piece you're talking about now, and I'm talking about a trend in the culture that now people have talked about a lot lately. There was that piece in the Atlantic about how elite college students can't read. And actually it is in the level of literacy. Like they can't parse the sentence. There was actually a piece in the New Yorker several years ago. Nathan Heller, he was talking about, it was about the decline in the humanities major, but he went to Harvard, his alma mater, and talked to some people, including, I think she was then the dean of students, Amanda Claybaugh, who's an English professor. And she said, she teaches the Scarlet Letter. And she said, my students, like, they can't parse the sentences like what's the verb, what's the subject. And I mean, the Scarlet Letter, the sentences aren't, I mean, this is not Chaucer. This is not Shakespeare. The sentences are more complex than the ones we encountered there. It's not Hemingway either, but it's not that difficult. But I believe her. And this isn't going to get better because, I mean, obviously this has to do with an epical change in the way we read, brought about by the internet, and we're not going back. You are quite right to point out that, as the general level of literacy declines, it's going to, the whole curve is going to go down. So the middle is going to go down, but also the high end is going to go down. The best writers are not going to write as well. Unless they're the kind of people who, whatever. I mean, there'll be a few maybe, but again, you can't write what the audience isn't going to understand. And if you, and also what kind of preparation have you had? I mean, even the average novelist, I mean, let alone the average journalist. You talked about, I think you said the op-ed page in the Times. I mean, however the writer writes, the editor, I mean, I can't tell you how frustrating it is. The one op-ed piece that I managed to get published in the Times on like my fifth try, by the time they finished with it, I mean, the ideas were all still there. This is not an intellectually complicated piece, but I mean, I was embarrassed to have it go out under my byline. And it made me realize why op-ed writing in the Times in general is so bad. The editors, I don't know why they do this. It must be some idea of what. Anyway, I'm going on at length, but the general principle I would say is, as the level of literacy goes down, it's going to go down everywhere. Whether we look at the speeches of politicians or journalists or inevitably, I think, even writers of literature.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Brave New World by Huxley, and another book, Fahrenheit 451. In the future which they predicted, and it was the present that we're living now. We don't even need to burn books anymore because nobody's reading them.
Yeah, and an analogy that I've had in mind for a long time is, there's certain sound media, I don't know, wax cylinder, that we don't have, you can't listen to them because you don't have the equipment to play them on. I mean, the LP has sort of been resurrected, but like you don't have a turntable, or you don't have an 8-track tape player, right? So it doesn't even matter if the recordings are out there because you don't have the equipment to access. So the analogy is with our mental equipment, right? I mean, the books are still there. They're always going to be there, but it's not even that people don't read them or don't want to read them. It's like what we've been saying. They can't read them. They no longer have, these Harvard students no longer have installed in their brains the hardware that they need to read the Scarlet Letter. I mean, it's terrifying because it means that the whole past is going to become inaccessible. Not the whole past, but I mean the whole literary, which is most of the past.
Well, finally, what sort of imaginative mind do you believe that, is necessary for good art criticism or good art appreciation in general?
Oh, yeah. And this actually brings us back to your earlier question about what critics do, or something like that. And I didn't have a chance to say this. What I say in the piece is that these critics who I grew up admiring, who I name in the piece, they were very, very different. I mean, Stanley Crouch was very different from, I don't know, Elizabeth Hardwick and so forth. But I think one of the key things they have in common is an ability to kind of scrape away all the accretions and encounter the work of art directly, right? Like they really start with their own responses. They're willing to be surprised by a work. I think it was I think I'm right in saying that Clement Greenberg, who became a great champion of abstract expressionism, was initially repelled by it, but he kind of rethought it. And that's a model for all of us, right? Is to I like to quote the great David Neidorff, who was president of Deep Springs College for a long time and is a friend. And he's got an essay where he says, I'm not going to be quoting exactly, but he says that to read a book truly is to cooperate with its effort to teach you something. So, and it goes back to what we were saying before about humility in the face of serious work. Like, I mean, it's as simple as saying go in with an open mind, but and an innocent, what the aestheticians call an innocent eye, right? Like, try as much as possible to surrender all your prejudices, preconceptions, including ones even that have been formed by previous work by the same artist, and let yourself respond freshly, and pay attention to that response and pursue that response. Where is it coming from? What obligations does it place on me of various kinds? And this is what's so wonderful about engaging with art, is that it can make ourselves new to ourselves. It can make us new to ourselves. It can surprise and disrupt us, which is so much better than just either this kind of a lazy form of entertainment or affirmation of our political beliefs or our, self-worth.
Yeah, and I certainly believe that the power of art, and I think it is a unique power that no real politics or philosophy has, is that it has the power to, in some ways, break up your old self and reconstruct a new self out of that.
And this brings us back to what we were saying about Dylan and David Lynch, that that great artists have the power to create our consciousness, to actually co-create our consciousness in an ongoing way.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much once again, Bill Deresiewicz, for joining the show.
Always happy to talk to you.